Picture this, if you will. It's July 15th, 1834. The sun has barely crested the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, and already the Green River Valley is alive with the kind of organized chaos that only happens when 500 of the most independent, stubborn, and frankly dangerous men in North America decide to have a party. This is the 20th Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, and if you don't know what that means, think of it as the ultimate trade show meets family reunion, meets drunken brawl, all rolled into one magnificent spectacle that would make modern festival organizers weep with envy. For 11 months out of the year, these mountain men lived in isolation that would drive most of us stark, raving mad. But for one glorious month each summer, they descended on predetermined locations like this valley to trade, drink, fight, gamble, and generally remind themselves that they were still part of the human species. Now, among these weathered faces and buckskin-clad bodies, there's one man who's about to become the center of attention, though not in the way he'd prefer. 26-year-old Jedediah Coulter stands apart from the crowd, not because he's trying to be antisocial, but because there's something different about him. While the veterans like Thomas Black Tom Morrison, a man who'd survived 15 Rocky Mountain winters, which in those days was like surviving 15 tours of duty in hell, are busy trading their winter's haul of beaver pelts for supplies, whiskey, and news from civilization, Coulter is doing something that makes everyone stop and stare. He's unpacking meat. But not just any meat. This stuff looks wrong. It's wrapped in what appears to be rawhide bundles, but these bundles are covered in some kind of greasy mixture that gleams in the morning light, like it's been dipped in bear fat mixed with God knows what else. The smell hits you next, not the familiar, comforting smell of salt-cured bacon or jerky that every mountain man knows by heart, but something else entirely, something wild and strange and faintly medicinal, like walking through a forest of juniper trees after a rainstorm. Now remember, these are men who pride themselves on knowing everything there is to know about survival in the wilderness. They've seen it all, done it all, and most importantly, they've survived it all using methods passed down from their fathers and grandfathers. Salt-curing meat isn't just a technique to them, it's a badge of honor, a connection to civilization, proof that they're not just savages running around in animal skins. So, when Coulter starts laying out strips of elk meat that look like they've been dipped in some kind of Indian witch's brew, the reaction is swift and merciless. Morrison, his weathered face cracking into a grin that reveals gaps where teeth used to be, takes one look at Coulter's provisions and lets out a bark of laughter that carries across the entire camp. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison announces to anyone within shouting distance, which in a mountain man camp means pretty much everyone. "Looks like young Coulter here has gone native on us. That meat'll be crawling with maggots before we're done with this rendezvous, mark my words." The French-Canadian trappers, those proud descendants of voyageurs who'd been exploring this continent since before most Americans knew it existed, gather around with the kind of collective disdain that only the truly experienced can muster. They start muttering among themselves in their peculiar mix of French and English, and the phrase folie sauvage, savage foolishness, keeps floating through the air like smoke from their pipes. But here's what makes this moment so fascinating, so perfectly emblematic of how progress actually happens in the real world. Coulter isn't some wild-eyed experimenter throwing caution to the wind. He's a careful, methodical man who's spent an entire isolated winter near the Yellowstone Hot Springs, and yes, this is the same area where Old Faithful performs her daily magic show, though in 1834 it was just known as that weird place where the earth bubbles and steams for no apparent reason. During that long, brutal winter, when the snow piled up to the eaves of his cabin and the temperature dropped to levels that would freeze spit before it hit the ground, Coulter learned something that would soon make every one of these laughing, mocking mountain men eat their words, quite literally, as it turns out. His method wasn't some half-baked experiment. It was a carefully refined process that combined rendered bear fat, not just any bear fat, mind you, but fat rendered at specific temperatures, using techniques that took months to perfect, with crushed juniper berries that had to be harvested at exactly the right time of year. Add to that wild sage and pine resin, each component serving a specific purpose in creating what amounted to an airtight seal around the meat that preserved it in ways their beloved salt never could. Think about the audacity of this moment. Here's a young man, barely 26 years old, standing in front of 500 of the most experienced wilderness survivors on the continent, essentially telling them that everything they know about food preservation is wrong. It's like a rookie engineer walking into NASA and announcing he's figured out a better way to build rockets. The betting starts that very night, because mountain men will bet on absolutely anything, whether it's which direction a leaf will fall, how many shots it takes to kill a charging grizzly, or in this case, how long it'll be before young Coulter comes crawling back begging for real food. Thomas Morrison, his confidence bolstered by 15 years of successful salt curing, puts up 5 beaver pelts, which in that economy represents serious money that Coulter will be sick of his fancy preserved meat within 2 weeks. Other men pile on. The Sublette brothers, William and Milton, who'd built their reputation on knowing everything there was to know about outfitting expeditions, each throw in their own side bets. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, yes. The same Charbonneau whose mother Sacagawea had guided Lewis and Clark to the Pacific Ocean 30 years earlier, shakes his head and mutters something about white men always thinking they can improve on what works. As the firelight dances across skeptical faces and homemade whiskey flows like water, though considerably more valuable, the camp settles into the familiar rhythm of rendezvous nights. Stories are told, lies are embellished, and futures are planned. But underneath all that familiar chaos, something unprecedented is happening. None of these proud, experienced, absolutely certain mountain men suspect they're witnessing the birth of a revolution in wilderness survival. They can't imagine that this quiet Virginian with his strange-smelling meat bundles is about to turn their world upside down. They have no idea that within 3 years, the method they're mocking tonight will be the difference between life and death for dozens of men, including some of the very people laughing hardest right now. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Here are men who've built their entire identity on being adaptable, on learning from the land, on surviving where others perish, and they're about to be schooled by someone who did exactly what they claim to do best. He listened, he learned, and he adapted, but that's a story for tomorrow night, when the real test begins. Would you like me to continue to the next chapter? Now, to understand how Jedediah Coulter came to possess this seemingly impossible knowledge, we need to rewind the clock 3 months before that fateful rendezvous. Picture the Snake River country in April of 1834, a landscape so vast and untamed that it makes our modern national parks look like suburban gardens. This is wilderness in its purest form, where the only sounds are wind through pine branches, the distant crack of ice breaking up on the river, and if you're unlucky, the kind of roar that turns your blood to ice water. Coulter was doing what mountain men did best, following beaver sign along tributaries that didn't even have names yet, looking for those perfect spots where industrious rodents had built their dams and created the deep pools that meant winter pelts and, more importantly, survival for another year. He'd been working his way upstream for 3 days, finding decent sign but nothing spectacular, when he heard it. The roar of an enraged grizzly bear. Now, if you've never heard this sound, consider yourself fortunate. It's not like the bears you see in movies or zoos. A truly angry grizzly produces a sound that seems to come from the earth itself, 800 pounds of muscle, claw, and fury expressing displeasure in a way that every living thing within a mile radius understands perfectly. It's the sound that turns experienced hunters into quivering children and sends elk crashing through underbrush like the forest itself is on fire. Most sane people would have headed in the opposite direction as fast as their legs could carry them. But Coulter wasn't most people. Something about that roar, maybe it was the sustained nature of it, or the way it seemed to echo off canyon walls, told him this wasn't a bear defending a kill or protecting cubs. This was something else entirely. Racing toward the sound through deadfall timber that would challenge a mountain goat, Coulter crested a small ridge and saw a scene that stopped him cold. Below, in a narrow ravine, an enormous grizzly was circling something trapped beneath a fallen pine tree. The tree, easily 3 feet in diameter and probably weighing several tons, had pinned an elderly Native American man who was clearly in serious trouble. Here's where the story gets interesting, because what happened next reveals something crucial about the kind of man Coulter was. He could have stayed hidden, could have waited for the bear to lose interest and wander off, then helped the trapped man if he was still alive, could have decided that discretion was the better part of valor and simply melted back into the forest like he'd never been there. Instead, he did what mountain men were trained to do. He made a decision and acted on it with absolute commitment. His rifle spoke once, a single shot that dropped 800 pounds of fury just 10 feet from the trapped elder. The bear rolled once, let out a final growl that sounded more like surprise than anger, and lay still. The man beneath the tree was named Broken Arrow Sees Far, and he was dying. Not from bear wounds, the animal hadn't gotten close enough for that, but from internal injuries sustained when the tree fell. His legs were almost certainly broken, and from the way he was breathing, Coulter suspected crushed ribs and possibly worse. Now, in the normal course of events, this would have been a tragic but brief encounter. Coulter would have made the old man as comfortable as possible, perhaps shared some food and water, and eventually continued on his way after the inevitable end. Mountain men weren't heartless, but they were practical, and the wilderness didn't offer many options for medical miracles. But Broken Arrow Sees Far had other plans. This elder, believing his death was approaching and having time to contemplate what would die with him, made a decision that would change everything. He looked at this young white man who had risked his life to save a stranger, and saw something that most of his people never saw in white faces: genuine respect and the willingness to listen. The preservation method that Broken Arrow began teaching wasn't just a technique, it was ceremony, philosophy, and science, all woven together into something that his people had been perfecting for generations. We're talking about knowledge that stretched back through the mists of time, refined during those brutal Ice Age winters when the difference between eating well and starving to death was often measured in the quality of your food preservation. First came the prayers to the animal's spirit. This wasn't just religious ritual, though it was certainly that, but also a practical reminder that what you were about to do required absolute attention to detail. Every step mattered. Every component had to be perfect. The life of the animal you'd taken deserved nothing less than your complete dedication to the process. The selection of juniper berries alone was a masterclass in botanical knowledge. Female berries only, harvested exclusively during the new moon, when their essential oils were at peak concentration. The elder taught Coulter how to identify the subtle differences between male and female juniper bushes, how to test berry ripeness by touch and smell, how to process them to release maximum antimicrobial properties without destroying their effectiveness. The bear fat rendering process was equally precise. The fat had to be heated to specific temperatures, never boiling, which would break down crucial compounds, and mixed with herbs that could only be gathered from elevations above 8,000 feet. We're talking about plants that grew in that thin air where most people could barely breathe, let alone hike around collecting medicinal herbs. But here's where the knowledge got truly sophisticated. The deepest secret wasn't in the preparation, it was in the storage. Broken Arrow taught Coulter how to identify natural refrigeration zones, places where the Earth's temperature remained constant year-round regardless of surface weather. These weren't just random cold spots, but specific geological formations where underground springs, air currents, and soil composition combined to create perfect preservation environments. Think about what this means. We're talking about people who understood principles of food science that wouldn't be formally documented by European scientists for another century. They knew about antimicrobial properties, oxygen barriers, and temperature control in ways that put our ancestors' preservation methods to shame. As the days passed and Broken Arrow slowly recovered enough strength to return to his people because, yes, against all odds, the tough old man actually survived his injuries, Coulter filled 20 pages with detailed notes written in charcoal on strips of birch bark. Every temperature, every ratio, every timing detail was carefully recorded. The elder explained how this knowledge was typically passed only to chosen young warriors, usually members of their own tribe, who had proven themselves worthy of such responsibility. The fact that he was sharing it with a white man was unprecedented, but Broken Arrow had seen something in Coulter that transcended racial boundaries, a genuine respect for indigenous knowledge, and the humility to learn from those who had mastered their environment. By the time Broken Arrow was strong enough to travel, something profound had happened. Coulter hadn't just learned a preservation technique, he'd been initiated into a way of thinking about the relationship between humans and the natural world that would change everything about how he approached wilderness survival. And in 3 months, at the Green River Rendezvous, that knowledge would begin to revolutionize an entire way of life. But first, it would have to survive the ultimate test, a winter that would push men to the very edge of survival and beyond. By autumn of 1836, something interesting was happening in the Mountain Man community. Whispers about Coulter's miracle meat had begun spreading through every trapping brigade from the Missouri headwaters all the way to the Columbia River country. These weren't the kind of men who gossiped like old women around a quilting circle, but when your life depends on having reliable food sources, word travels fast about anything that might give you an edge. The thing is, whispers and reality are two very different creatures, especially in the wilderness, where tall tales grow taller with each telling. Most of the veteran trappers figured Coulter had just gotten lucky with his preservation attempts, or maybe he'd stumbled onto a particularly good salt lick that nobody else knew about. After all, they'd been doing this for decades. How revolutionary could one young man's techniques really be? They were about to find out. The winter of 1837 turned out to be what the old-timers called a grey maker, the kind of season that turns young men's hair white and teaches everyone involved lessons they'll never forget. It started early, with heavy snows hitting the high country in October, weeks before anyone expected serious weather. Then came the January thaw that every mountain man dreaded, a false spring that melted just enough snow to soak everything through, followed by a brutal freeze that turned the entire landscape into a crystalline death trap. 3 separate trapping brigades found themselves trapped in the high country when that freeze hit, and every one of them discovered the same horrible truth. Their salt-cured provisions had gone bad. Not just a little spoiled, completely ruined. The January thaw had introduced moisture into their carefully sealed containers, and when the hard freeze came, it created conditions that turned their winter food supplies into putrid, inedible mush. The Ashley Henry Company, led by Jim Bridger himself, a man whose name would become synonymous with mountain wisdom, found themselves in particularly dire straits. Bridger was no greenhorn. He'd been working these mountains since he was barely 18 years old, and he knew every trick in the book for wilderness survival. But when you're trapped at 9,000 feet elevation with 30 men, and your food has turned into a pussavar, stinking mass of corruption, all the experience in the world doesn't fill empty bellies. Desperate men do desperate things. They started eating their leather harnesses, cutting strips from their saddles and boiling them into a kind of soup that had all the nutritional value of chewing on old boots. Pine bark became a delicacy. Men who had once been the masters of their environment were reduced to foraging like starving animals, competing with ravens and wolves for anything remotely edible. That's when word reached them about Coulter's caches. Now, Coulter wasn't some kind of wilderness philanthropist going around feeding every stranded trapper who ran into trouble, but he was a careful planner, and during his travels through the region, he'd established a network of food caches that would have impressed a modern logistics coordinator. These weren't random hiding spots where he'd buried a few strips of jerky. These were carefully chosen locations where his preserved meat could survive for extended periods under the most challenging conditions. The Cache Valley incident became the stuff of legend. 30 starving men, led by men who had mocked Coulter's methods just 2 years earlier, attempted to raid what they thought were his private food stores. They figured they'd take what they needed and worry about paying him back later, assuming they survived long enough for later to matter. What they found instead was something that completely redefined their understanding of what Coulter was all about. He hadn't just hidden food, he'd anticipated exactly this kind of desperate situation. Clear markers pointed toward emergency supplies, along with detailed instructions carved into tree bark, explaining how to find additional caches if the first ones weren't sufficient. But here's what really stopped them cold. The meat they discovered had been cached 18 months earlier. 18 months. Through a summer that had seen temperatures reach over 100 degrees, through a previous winter that had dropped below zero for weeks at a time, through spring flooding and autumn freezes. When they unwrapped those bundles with hands shaking from hunger and cold, they found meat that looked, smelled, and tasted like it had been preserved the day before. Jim Bridger himself, a man who had never publicly admitted being wrong about anything in his entire life, took one bite of meat that had survived 2 full winters and made an announcement that rippled through the Mountain Man community like an earthquake. He declared, in front of witnesses who would repeat his words around campfires for decades to come, that Coulter's preservation method was superior to any technique that had ever come out of the civilized world. Think about what that means. This is Jim Bridger we're talking about, the man who would later guide wagon trains across the Oregon Trail, who discovered the Great Salt Lake, who had more wilderness survival knowledge in his little finger than most people accumulate in a lifetime. When Jim Bridger says your technique is revolutionary, you've officially arrived. The revolution spread like wildfire after that. By spring, when the survivors finally made it down to lower elevations, Coulter found himself in the unexpected position of being the most sought-after teacher in the Rocky Mountains. Groups of 50 men at a time would gather around him, hanging on every word as he demonstrated the precise ratios of fat to herbs, the proper brain-tanning techniques for storage hides, and most importantly, how to identify and utilize those natural refrigeration zones that made long-term preservation possible. The economic implications were staggering. Trading posts that had built their entire business model around monopolizing the salt trade watched their influence crumble virtually overnight. Why pay premium prices for salt and risk spoilage when you could learn techniques that made you completely self-sufficient? Trappers who had been dependent on annual supply runs suddenly found themselves with a level of independence that changed the entire power structure of the fur trade. But the real revolution wasn't economic, it was cultural. Mountain men who had dismissed Native American knowledge as primitive superstition began actively seeking out indigenous teachers for everything from medicine to weather prediction to advanced tracking methods. Coulter's success had opened their eyes to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the people who had been living successfully in this environment for thousands of years might know a thing or two that European traditions had missed. The preservation method became the catalyst for a broader information exchange economy, where cultural knowledge became as valuable as beaver pelts. Military expeditions took notice too. When John C. Fremont organized his 1842 expedition to map the Oregon Trail, he specifically recruited men who had been trained in Coulter's preservation techniques, understanding that reliable food sources could make the difference between a successful mapping mission and a disaster that would set westward expansion back by decades. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came in the spring of 1838, when Thomas Black Tom Morrison, the same man who had led the mockery at that 1834 rendezvous, publicly apologized to Coulter in front of the entire Green River gathering. Morrison stood up, raised his cup of trade whiskey, and made a toast that became famous throughout the Mountain West. To Jedediah Coulter, who had the wisdom to listen when the rest of us were too busy talking. The transformation was complete. In less than 4 years, a quiet Virginian had taken knowledge gifted to him by a dying Shoshone elder and used it to revolutionize an entire way of life. But like all great changes, this one would have consequences that reached far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The transformation that followed went deeper than anyone could have predicted. What started as a simple improvement in food preservation techniques became something much more profound, a fundamental shift in how an entire culture viewed knowledge, wisdom, and the relationship between different ways of understanding the world. Mountain men, who had built their identity around rugged individualism and European-derived survival techniques, suddenly found themselves in the uncomfortable position of realizing they had a lot to learn. The success of Coulter's preservation method opened floodgates that had been sealed by centuries of cultural prejudice. These proud, independent men began actively seeking out Native American teachers for everything from advanced medicine to weather prediction methods that could mean the difference between life and death in the high country. The change created what we might recognize today as an information economy, where cultural knowledge became as valuable as beaver pelts or trade goods. Indigenous techniques for treating frostbite, reading weather patterns weeks in advance, tracking animals across terrain that would challenge modern GPS systems. All of these suddenly became hot commodities in a world where survival depended on having every possible advantage. Consider the broader implications. When John C. Fremont organized his 1842 expedition to map what would become the Oregon Trail, he didn't just recruit experienced mountain men, he specifically sought out men who had been trained in what was becoming known as Coulter's method. Fremont understood that an expedition mapping unknown territory for future wagon trains couldn't afford to fail because of food spoilage or inadequate provisions. The success of that expedition, which provided the detailed maps that guided hundreds of thousands of pioneers to Oregon and California, owed a debt to knowledge that had originated with a Shoshone elder dying beneath a fallen pine and tree. But perhaps the most poignant example of how completely things had changed came in 1848, 14 years after that first mocking reception at the Green River Rendezvous. Thomas Black Tom Morrison, the same man who had led the ridicule and bet against Coulter's methods, lay dying of pneumonia in a crude cabin near Fort Laramie. Morrison was 63 years old by then, ancient by mountain man standards, and he knew his time was running short. He sent word for Coulter to come, not because he needed medical help, they both knew pneumonia in those conditions was essentially a death sentence, but because he had something that needed saying. When Coulter arrived, now graying and prosperous from his innovations, Morrison made a confession that would become frontier gospel. Through labored breathing and with witnesses present to ensure his words were remembered, the old trapper admitted something that cut to the heart of everything that had changed over those 14 years. Morrison had lost 3 sons to starvation in previous winters. 3 sons. Boys who had died because their father was too proud, too set in his ways, too convinced of his own expertise to abandon salt-curing methods that had repeatedly failed when they were needed most. His dying words became a lesson that echoed through mountain man culture for generations. Pride fills no belly when winter comes calling. Think about the weight of that confession. Here was a man acknowledging that his stubborn adherence to traditional methods that seemed logical, that had worked adequately in easier conditions, that connected him to his cultural heritage, had cost him the lives of his own children. The tragedy wasn't just personal. It was emblematic of how resistance to new ideas, especially ideas that challenge our fundamental assumptions about the world, can have consequences that reach far beyond our own pride. Modern food scientists at the University of Wyoming have analyzed Coulter's detailed notes, now housed in the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, and the results are fascinating. The combination of natural antimicrobials from juniper berries, the anaerobic environment created by rendered bear fat, and the consistent cool temperatures of those natural refrigeration zones creates preservation conditions that are, in many ways, superior to anything achievable through simple salt curing. But the real revelation comes when you understand how sophisticated the indigenous knowledge actually was. We're talking about people who understood principles of food science that wouldn't be formally documented by European researchers until the late 19th century. They knew about essential oil concentrations in plants, about the importance of oxygen barriers in preventing spoilage, about how geological formations could be used to create natural refrigeration systems. This wasn't primitive knowledge, it was advanced science disguised as traditional practice. Survivalists and food preservation enthusiasts today study Coulter's notes with the same intensity that military tacticians study famous battles. The techniques work as well now as they did in 1834, and in some ways they're more relevant than ever. In our modern world of industrial food production and global supply chains, there's something deeply appealing about preservation methods that rely on natural ingredients and geological features rather than chemical additives and electric refrigeration. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Coulter's story isn't the preservation technique itself, it's the lesson about wisdom and where it comes from. Here was a young man who had the humility to recognize that indigenous knowledge might be superior to European traditions. The courage to act on that recognition, despite mockery from his peers, and the generosity to share what he learned rather than hoarding it for personal advantage. The transformation that followed challenges every assumption about cultural superiority that dominated 19th-century America. At a time when government policy was systematically destroying Native American communities and dismissing indigenous knowledge as primitive superstition, mountain men were quietly learning that some of the most sophisticated survival techniques on the continent came from the very people their civilization was trying to eliminate. Coulter died in 1872, outliving most of his contemporaries by decades. His grave marker in the small cemetery outside Jackson, Wyoming, bears an inscription that captures everything his life came to represent. He listened when others laughed, and lived when others perished. That epitaph tells us something crucial about how progress actually happens in the real world. It's not usually the loudest voices or the most confident experts who drive real innovation. It's the people who have the humility to recognize that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, the courage to challenge established methods when those methods prove inadequate, and the persistence to perfect new techniques, even when they're initially met with skepticism. In the end, Jedediah Coulter's story reminds us that the newest ways are not always the best ways, but neither are the oldest. The best ways are usually the ones that work, regardless of where they come from or how they challenge our preconceptions. And sometimes, just sometimes, those ways come to us through the generosity of a dying elder who recognizes something worth preserving in a young man willing to listen. The mountains themselves remember. Every cache site that Coulter marked, every natural refrigeration zone he mapped, every location where his preserved meat sustained life during those brutal winters, they're all still there, waiting for anyone with the wisdom to learn from them. The knowledge lives on, carved not just in stone markers but in the very landscape that taught it, passed down from a Shoshone elder to a Virginia trapper to anyone humble enough to accept that the most profound innovations often come disguised as ancient wisdom.